Right, everyone will move up since you have a small crowd. There's no reason that push back.
If you'd like to move up closer, you're certainly welcome. We weren't quite sure in this Christmas season,
Just bring your chair and put it
and
right
with
up
all
there.
the conflicts of schedules that there are, we weren't sure how many we'd have tonight. But as Rick and I were just saying, any size group is a good group. And we're very pleased to have you with us tonight. I'm Kurt Bench. I'm the owner and chief bill payer of Benchmark Books.
Testimony of the resurrection.
Yeah, well, I'll get into that real quick, but as you can see by our little banner here that I'm still paying for, we're celebrating 25 years of being in business as Benchmark Books. Prior to that, as many of you know, I worked for Brand X, for Deseret Book, for 14 happy years actually, other than, well, maybe all 14 weren't happy. During Mark Hoffman era, it wasn't real happy. But anyway, I've been in the book business most of my adult life, and if you haven't already gotten that impression, I do love books, and I love people who love books like you. And you're the ones who make this happen and make our business work, and we really appreciate it. Appreciate you taking the time to come out. The little comment about the resurrection, although an exaggeration, I won't talk too much about it, but I just had my second open heart surgery not very long ago, so I'm not my usual dynamic self filled with vim and vigor. Still kind of feeling the effects, but I had to be here tonight because this is a special occasion, and so they did some rooting around in there and made some changes. I told my wife that I was experiencing symptoms like nausea, and food kind of repelled me, and odors and so on, and I've been eating soda crackers, and she said, well, it's obvious, you're pregnant. So I guess I can't attribute it to the surgery. But yeah, it's quite I really am blessed to be here, honestly, because the first time, 12 years ago, was an emergency that I almost didn't make, and this time we planned ahead, but they did a lot of work on me, and so I'm really grateful to be here because by all odds, I really shouldn't be. But I still had lots of bills to pay here, so, and my wife said that I should stick around. So, this is Pat, and Pat is responsible for lots of things here, but for the wonderful refreshments that we probably have plenty of, anticipating a few more people. But after we're done with and for those who didn't catch the news, I really apologize for those who came in a little later. The co-author of both of these books, the latest, of course, is How We Got the Doctrine and Covenants, Richard Turley and William Slaughter. They also did How We Got the Book of Mormon last year. And Bill took sick suddenly and just could not make it and apologized, said he really wished he could be here. So I apologize as well. Rick will be happy to sign any books, and we'll talk a little bit about a few that he had come on in. But Bill said he would do his very best to come in Thursday or Friday and sign books so that they'll be signed by both authors. So please don't hesitate to, we've got them here in the front of the store, and after Rick has spoken and answered questions, then we'd invite you to come up and purchase any of the titles that are here. We have Bill's on the other side, or the other counter, and we can get him to sign those for you as well. So if you could just purchase the books first here at the front counter and then take them to Rick, and he'll be happy to sign. If you'd like a personal inscription, you're fine doing that, aren't you? Another thing that you should know, you see this camera, even though we just got broken into recently, it's not a security camera. We do put these signings on YouTube afterwards, and so try to reach a wider audience, and if you miss something during tonight, then you can watch it. When will it be on, Brian?
Next couple days. We'll have it up on the website.
Okay. And we would also invite you, speaking of websites, we've put a lot of effort into upgrading our website. We would invite you to visit it often, and it's improving, and we also would like you to, how do we want to do the...
Yeah, so you can sign up on the website to follow it, and what that does is every time that we post something new on it, you get an email saying that we've posted something with the content of it and a link to it.
Okay. And most of you, maybe not all, but for those of you who are here for the first time, we welcome you. Many of you are long-time customers, so you kind of know the drill, but I will just give a very brief intro to our special guest author tonight, and then, as I mentioned, he'll speak to us for about a half hour or so, and then answer any questions that you have, and then he'll be happy to stay and sign books for you. And we do invite you to browse the rest of the store as well. We have lots and lots of books, both new books are in this part of the store for the most part. The tables and some of the fixtures in the middle are sale books. Some of our rarer books are in the glass cases, and then around the perimeter of the store are the used and out of print. And if you need help from any of us, please just feel free to ask. I've known Rick Turley for quite a few years, and have always admired him. I won't try not to embarrass him, but Rick is the assistant church historian and recorder. Until just recently, he was working closely with Elder Marlon K. Jensen, who was the church historian and recorder. He is the chairman of the editorial board of the Joseph Smith Papers Project. He is the author or co-author of a number of books. I was just remarking to him the contrast between the signing for Massacre at Mountain Meadows, when he and the other two authors were here, and we had the largest crowd we've ever had. This isn't the smallest, but it's smaller than normal. But we had over 100 people, which for us is pretty big time. This is an extremely important book on a very dark subject, but an important one in our history. And there are other things related to it on the Mountain Meadows Massacre that Rick was involved with. This is the second volume. I'm going to set this down. The second volume of the Women of Faith series. How many were there?
7.
7 books eventually. And knowing Rick, probably won't be all that long, because I don't know when he sleeps, but he certainly spends a lot of time researching and writing. But we have both volumes here. He has been involved in a number of projects, historical projects. He's very involved in historical associations. Rick is kind of a major force behind the scenes. He doesn't get a lot of publicity, but he's responsible for a lot of things that we enjoy today in church history circles, including the new church history library. Was a major influence in how that building, and if you have not been to that structure, you really need to go. It's amazing, and it's state of the art, and Rick was very involved in that, and that's where his office is. I could go on, but I value Rick not only as a historian and a fine writer. And by the way, I read over the weekend, I read every word. Well, okay, I didn't get every note, every footnote or endnote, but I did read the entire text of How We Got the Doctrine and Covenants. I really enjoy the book. It's got great balance, lots of illustrations, and he's going to point out some of them, but things you'll never see in your lifetime otherwise. And it's just how the book came to be, and some of the various important additions of it, and done in a way that anybody can read and enjoy. The only fault I could find with it, Rick, is I didn't see any citation to the parallel Doctrine and Covenants, which I had a little hand in doing. But no, it's a beautiful book. Rick admits to being a design freak, as he put it, and he was very influential in how this book is designed. And just thumb through it and look at, even take the jacket off, or not off, but just peel it back. Look at the beautiful cloth binding. Look at the design throughout the book. And on the cover is the Warren Cowdery first edition of the Doctrine and Covenants, bound in red leather. Just beautiful. Things that most of us will never see. Fortunately, I've been able to see a few. I've gone on too long, and now it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce Richard Turley.
Thank you, Kurt, for that. It's a very kind introduction. My life and Kurt's life do go back a long way. We intertwine. In a prior life, before I was working for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I was a book collector. And I found my way, like most book collectors, down into the bottom floor of the Deseret Book Facility, across the street from the church administrative offices, where I met Kurt for the first time, and we chatted about books, and he did the same thing there that he's doing here. And that relationship went on for a long time, learning about books, and then I stopped being a really avid book collector when I got access to all the books I would ever want on this field, but I still like to pick up a few here and there that are significant. Interestingly, Kurt's wife, Pat, and I go back even further. When I was, just before my junior year of high school, my family moved to Utah from out of state, and we moved into the East Mill Creek area, and I ended up being neighbors with Pat. And she and my sister were good friends. Kurt and Pat still live in that area, don't you?
Same house.
Same house as where her parents grew up. So we go back a long way. My interest in books and book collecting and book design and Latter-day Saint Church history are all intertwined, in part because I developed a natural fascination for them when I was in my youth, and in part because I was fortunate enough to have some wonderful experiences along the way that nurtured me in that direction. When I was in high school, I had the good fortune of being the academic vice president of the Salt Lake Valley North Seminary District Council, which meant that during my senior year in high school, I had to write Seminary Bowl questions on church history topics for 15 schools in the Salt Lake Valley, which caused me to immerse myself fairly deeply in the subject for a high school senior. And it was a fascinating immersion that got me even more hungry to study more, and I continued to study church history as I was doing other things. When I was probably a junior or senior in high school, just after we had moved here, I had breakfast one morning with my father, alone, which was a very rare occasion in our household because my parents had 7 children in 7 years. And I kid you not, my sister was born in January, I was born the next February, my next sister the next March, the next sister on her birthday the next March, and so on down the line. So the oldest was 7 when the 7th was born, which meant that when we had our family together, we had 9 people with the children very closely spaced, and it was a party all the time. It was a party. Very rare to have one-on-one time with a parent. But I got up early one morning for an extracurricular activity. My father was having breakfast, and we sat down together, and he said, "Rick, what do you want to do when you grow up?" And I loved Mormon history. I loved every subject, as a matter of fact. And so I said to my father, "I don't know. I'm not one of those persons who just sort of is naturally drawn to one thing and one thing only. I've always had these broad interests." And so he said to me, "Well, if you're really interested in a broad range of subjects, I would recommend you go into law." And the reason he said that was that we had moved to Utah when he was hired as the first state science advisor for the state of Utah with a concurrent professorship at the University of Utah. he said, I'm always up on Capitol Hill advising the governor and the legislature, and I see lots of people from lots of different professions, and the funny thing is, a lot of them are lawyers. So law appears to be a very flexible profession. If you're not sure what you want to do, go into law. So I chose law, but I nurtured this interest in Mormon history on the side, along with interests in lots of other things. I took history-related courses when I was in law school, and never really expected to spend full time in it. I didn't think you could make a living with Mormon history. It just didn't seem like a viable alternative. And then I was fortunate enough along the way to end up doing what I'm doing today. And I'm coming up on my 27th anniversary of doing what I'm doing. Now, there were some formative experiences that helped to explain why I would make a book like this. One of those experiences came when I was an undergraduate. I was looking for a job. I was teaching at the MTC down in Provo, teaching Japanese, but I wanted to do something that was more academically inclined. And so I was looking at job postings at BYU, and there was a job posting for a writer at the Harold B. Lee Library. So I went and interviewed with the person who was in the acquisitions department on the top floor of the Harold B. Lee Library, someone who later became a very close friend, Rick Grunder. And Rick was actually looking for a graduate student, somebody who had a little more experience than I had. But he gave me a document to take home and asked me to edit the document. And then I brought that document back to him and left it thinking, well, this is a long shot, but you know, you got to stretch in life sometimes. So I left my edit with him. I went back to my apartment. A short time later, Rick called me on the line, and he said, this is great. When would you like to start? And he then became my mentor, teaching me about books and manuscripts and the book arts, and I got to spend, as an undergraduate, time writing about books and manuscripts, including books and manuscripts relating to Mormon history. At the same time, being nurtured by him and his boss, Dean Larson, who was a real book aficionado, Chad Flake, other people like that who were at the Harold B. Lee Library. So I developed a great love not only for Mormon history, but for the books that I saw there in the manuscripts and the book arts. Since that time, I have spent time when I can in Charlottesville, Virginia, and before that in New York City at Columbia University, going to the Rare Book School. Anybody here ever been to Rare Book School? Kurt has. It's a place where you can learn about books and the book arts in 1 week courses, 1 week very intensive courses. I'm going to be headed there again the summer of 2013. So all that is to explain why I would create a book like these two that he mentioned, how we got the Book of Mormon and how we got the Doctrine and Covenants. For one thing, I wanted to somehow or another make the discoveries of the Joseph Smith Papers project more widely available to a broader audience. Now, the volumes themselves, I'm sure you've all seen them, they're significant volumes from many perspectives, one of which is that we're publishing everything that is a Joseph Smith paper that we can find anywhere, that we can get permission to publish. A lot of them are in private hands. All the church ones, we have permission to publish, but the ones in private hands will publish as many as we possibly can. So this will be the first really complete set of publications of Joseph Smith's papers. When we decided to publish them, we decided that we're going to maintain the highest academic standards in the publication and also make this a very attractive set of books. So when we were choosing such things as the boards and the headbands and the paper and all of the elements that go into a book, the cloth, I was very, very particular in setting specifications for this. Same is true with the leather versions, because I love books that are not only good on the inside, but good on the outside as well. As we went to work creating these, we discovered that, first of all, they were very popular for a series of books that come at you from a highly academic kind of perspective. We had advisors on this project from Yale University, and they showed us how to get these things done the way we wanted to get them done. And when this first volume came out and quickly sold 67,000 copies, we asked our friends at Yale, does that happen? And back on? Battery working? All right. So what we discovered is that these books became extraordinarily popular for documentary editions. A lot of documentary editions, we learned, sell 800 copies in a lifetime, maybe 1,200. They sold 2,000 or 3,000, it would be a bestseller. 5,000 copies would be a runaway bestseller, but 67,000 copies, no. Then it just doesn't happen. And I think that shows the appetite among the reading public for high-quality works related to church history. But even with that, over time we began to wonder how many of those 67,000 copies were actually read, and how many were purchased for gifts, set underneath the Christmas tree, unwrapped, and then put on the shelf. We wanted to have the discoveries from the Joseph Smith Papers Project reach an even broader audience. And so as we began brainstorming about how to do that, I thought, well, let me experiment with some books. And that's how we came up with this idea for how we got the Book of Mormon and how we got the Doctrine and Covenants. What if we were to take some of the major findings from the Joseph Smith Papers and put them in a series of picture books, highly illustrated picture books that contained illustrations that by themselves were worth having because they were items that people had never seen before, or they were photographs that were composed in such a way that they were artistic themselves. What if we were to take the findings, add them to pictures, and then create a highly readable text that might appeal to the general population instead of just to specialists? And so that was the theory behind doing this. And these are consciously created with a devotional tone to them, in another effort to try to attract a broad readership, with the hope that that broad readership will work from here eventually into the Joseph Smith Papers themselves. So Kurt mentioned he'd read these, but he hadn't read every note. If you had read every note, what you would see is that this is very heavily documented from the Joseph Smith Papers Project. So the final product, we think, is unusual, highly unusual. Where do you find a series of books pitched to a popular audience based on a solid foundation of the highest scholarship, and yet intended for a general readership in a way that's highly readable and has got wonderful illustrations? That was the theory behind it. And we'll see how well that theory works over the years as people study these. I think a lot of people take a look at them at first and they say, oh, thin picture book, it's, must not be for me. I like the heavy church history. But in fact, these are very important syntheses of much of what was discovered in the Joseph Smith Papers. And then the illustrations. Kurt mentioned the illustrations. We have several kinds of illustrations here. This, of course, is just popular art, popular illustration. But we also have in these books, I'll use the most recent one, we also have in these books historical photographs, some of which have not been generally seen before. We have copies of historical documents that help to make the text more understandable. And then we have photographs that we created ourselves. We brought in Matt Ryer, who's a friend of ours, to do some original photographic work. And we brought out some of our very best materials, and we had him shoot them in a way that we thought might be interesting to the reading public. And one photograph that Kurt mentioned I want to show you is this one right here on page 38. How many of you seen a copy of a Book of Commandments? Okay, a handful of you here. How many of you seen 6 copies together? Okay, the church owns 6 of the 29 existing copies of a Book of Commandments. And so we thought, that would be fun to pull all of those copies together and make a photograph. So that's what this illustration is. This is a photograph that we composed. This took us a long time to create, because if you're a design freak like I am, you know that groupings of 6 are hard. Usually odd numbers make for easier design, but we had 6. We wanted to show all of them, so we worked with Matt and we lined these up and we tweaked them. We took images and we blew them up in a computer and we kept working with it until we got an image that we thought was pleasing from an artistic perspective, but also had this wonderful array. First time in history that 6 copies of the Book of Commandments had been shown together. Now, most people might breeze by this, but those of you who are real history or book aficionados, you'll find in the pages of this volume some really fascinating items. As you're studying the history of the text, of the Doctrine and Covenants, you might be interested in such things as the marked up copies that we have in here. Here, for example, is Orson Pratt's marked up copy of the 1854 edition, showing how he divided the original text into verses. Most people have never seen this book. I can see it whenever I want, but most people never have the chance, either because of distance or because they don't come in and ask for it. There it is right there. You can see those images. And then finally, we wanted it to be a beautiful book. So every once in a while, I get a chance to indulge my design tastes on a book, and this was one series where I specifically asked permission to do that. So once again, we've got a nice cloth, we've got marbled paste downs, high quality paper, beautiful images, and we spent a lot of money on design. We went over budget, frankly, on design for these books. But we spent a lot of time tweaking images, making them just right in order to create a book that we felt would be pleasing. So what about the content? What story are we trying to tell here with how we got the Doctrine and Covenants? Basically, we're trying to tell the story of how the revelations of Joseph Smith moved from their initial oral representation onto paper, and then went from one paper to another, and then from that paper into print, and then went through various printed editions to the present day. That story, I think, is extremely important for people interested in Mormon history and people interested in the history and doctrine of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to understand. I think too often people fall into the fallacy of thinking that Joseph Smith's revelations somehow or another came directly onto stone where they were etched, never to change. When in fact, if you study the materials that we're providing for the Joseph Smith Papers Project, both in these volumes and online, what you see is a wonderful progression of that text through time. And so we've captured that here, chapter by chapter, explaining how each edition and how each set of manuscripts were significant in getting from where we started with the Doctrine and Covenants revelations to the present day, including all of the helps that have been added over time to help the reader better understand the context, the historical context, and the documentary context of the Doctrine and Covenants. That's the essence of it. I'm happy to entertain questions. Who has some questions? Yes?
What did you project on sales of this book? It obviously was planned.
Yeah, we didn't know. We didn't know what the appetite would be. This, of course, is brand new. This one continues to sell. A few thousand copies.
Do you know what the print run was?
I don't even know what the print runs are on these. There's some of my books I can tell you what the print run is. Print run on Victims was 10,000. Print run on Massacre Mountain Meadows was 50,000. These, we were hoping, let's get a few thousand and just sort of see what happens. See what the public reaction is.
See if they'll react like you want.
Yeah. And so I've been interested to sort of sit back and see what happens, because these were experimental volumes to me. I've watched sort of blog posts and reviews and so on to see, well, are people getting it, or is it just going completely sort of between the two groups, the group that likes the real heavy history and the group that likes the popular stuff. And I think what's happening is there's an awakening sensibility to what we were trying to do with these. As I said, they are consciously devotional in tone as a way of trying to get a broader readership into the Joseph Smith Papers. Yes?
As I understand it, in his talk to Utah State or Weber State back in some months ago, Elder Jensen talked about how the church was opening up more because of the problems with people leaving the church after finding out many things on the internet that they had not learned as they were growing up in the church. And then I saw in the last edition of the Ensign, there was on the front cover talking about some new restructuring or new things going to the youth. Does the church plan on introducing some of these ideas that we find out on the internet to the youth earlier on in their education, so that they're not surprised when they find out that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy. They find out more about the history of the discrimination against the blacks. They find out about the oath of vengeance in the temple, which was a startling. I'm a convert. It was a startling thing to me when I read about that on a non-Mormon or anti-Mormon site. Are there plans to expose the youth to this more?
Short answer, yes. Now let me just sort of back up and explain where I'm coming from on that. As I mentioned to you, I grew up learning a lot about church history. By the time I was in high school, I was aware of most of the things that a lot of people are just discovering today because I read widely. I was very curious, still am a very curious person. I love to learn about things, figure them out. And so as a high school student, I'm learning about a lot of these things. And in that process, I'm still retaining my faith. And as you might imagine, after 27 years at church headquarters in church history, I'm a magnet for people who have questions about the history of the church. And my responses are very candid. Because my parents were very candid with me, and I feel that that kind of candor is the best way to answer people's questions. So I've been a magnet. I've had people come to me, some of whom are faithful church members who just have curiosity questions, some of whom have left the church and have various feelings towards the church, some friendly, some that are not friendly, and everybody in between. And so they come to me and they ask me these questions, and I've pondered the question over time. So how is it that I've learned about these things over time, and yet somehow or another other people miss it? How is it they miss it? And I think to a great extent it has to do with the fact that we have over time created a curriculum that is highly simplified, in part in order to get it to the far-flung parts of the world as the church has gone from being a Utah-centric church to becoming a global church. And so that movement, I remember attending a meeting once early on in my career at church headquarters where they pulled together all of the key personnel at church headquarters, including the leaders, and they put a picture up. In those days, it probably wasn't PowerPoint, it was probably an overhead. And they put this picture up, and the picture showed a tiny door that represented the International Church. And then there was somebody pulling a red wagon. And on that red wagon was piled all of the published material that the church produces about itself. And as you can tell from this analogy, they were saying, we can't get all of that through this little tiny door. We somehow or another have to really simplify what we're doing so that we can take it to the masses. So I think that was a very important process in getting information to people around the world. But in that same process, a lot of things that were taken for granted by me and people of my generation got omitted because it's too much to take through it. And I think what's happened is that over time people have grown up without knowing things that some of us took for granted as a youth, particularly those of us who were curious and just sort of naturally learned those things on our own. That recognition now coming to me and to others, we are working very consciously to see if we can't get more of that information out, not only through our work in the church history department, but also by pairing up with the church education system, with the church curriculum people, to make such information more available. So yes, I think over time you'll see more of that.
Can I, forgive me for
Sure.
interjecting here. This book that Rick was instrumental in producing would never have been done a generation ago.
Agreed.
And it is largely due to this man right here, that we have one of the most candid treatments of the darkest chapter in our history. And they don't pull punches. And Rick is, I mean, again, I'm not trying to embarrass him, but he is opening lots of doors. And sir, I think he is going to make possible the kind of thing you're talking about, because he is interested in real history and in making it available to people. And I've talked to people who have gone to Rick with some pretty disturbing or candid questions and got not a disturbing answer, but a candid answer, and one that really helped them. And so I really give Rick a lot of credit for making some real headway and doing some groundbreaking work. This was not produced by the church, but they were all church employees, and had full access. In fact, you combed the entire, I don't know, maybe not the world, but everywhere you could think of for original material or important material relating to the Mountain Meadows Massacre, and they turned over every leaf and produced a book that is just something, like I said, we would have never seen otherwise.
I've read
so,
it in the section.
so I give him
I should have
a
brought
lot
my
of
copy to this.
And I want to say something about that book. We did, if you look in the back at our source documentation, we did research in 31 states plus the District of Columbia to produce this book. Brent Reber here was part of that process. Our goal was to turn over every stone that we could find and collect that material, and then not just to write a book, which somebody could then say, well, that's just your interpretation. Our goal was to get all the source documentation publicly available, and it is. Everything that's in here that we used and gathered from around the country is available at the Church History Library for you to look at. So you can evaluate it, and you can compare your interpretation against our interpretation. There was so much material that we couldn't publish it all in book form, wouldn't have been economically viable. But we thought, well, what are some of the best documents that we can publish? So we created this volume here because we knew that there were certain documents that Juanita Brooks never saw, or at least never got to read. She saw some of them from a distance, okay? Those of you who are students of Juanita Brooks. And we thought, wouldn't it be nice to make available in published form the documents that Juanita Brooks never got a chance to see, but we did. And so that's why we produced this volume, which is called Mountain Meadows Massacre, the Andrew Jensen and David H. Morris collections. These are the two collections that Juanita Brooks wanted to see but was not able to see. One of them was a series of documents that had been created by my predecessor, church historian Andrew Jensen, in 1892. And the other set was a set collected by David H. Morris, a southern Utah lawyer who had clients who had been in the Mountain Meadows Massacre. And so he started collecting affidavits and other information from them. This is material that had not been seen for 100 years. And so we took that material and we published it every page, and then transcriptions along with introductions so that people could see that material. Now there were some hands. Gary?
Rick, I would imagine that over the last 27 years you've seen a lot of changes and some pretty significant changes at the History Library. How have your own personal views on institutionally produced history changed over that period of time?
Well, I've become increasingly strong in my belief that the best way to present information like that is undiluted. You know, present it straight, let people see what you have there. I'm a real advocate of transparency. In my early days, would I have been that way? Probably, but I've just become more entrenched in that position. I also think that it's important to introduce more difficult subjects earlier on. Certainly earlier on than we did at the time I came in. And what you may find interesting is that there's a consensus, a growing consensus to do that at church headquarters. So over time, I think you are going to see a tremendous enriching. We want to be a history-rich church with a history-rich curriculum, history-rich church history materials. We have put online at the Church History Library, a lot of people don't know this, we put online already hundreds of thousands of documents, and we continue to put those on at an astonishing rate. Right now, we're also putting family history documents online, the things that are up at the Granite Mountain Records Vault. During this year that's just ending, I think we will have taken about 350 million microfilm images and converted those to digital at the Granite Mountain Records Vault. And in the church history arena, we are working to dramatically increase the numbers of items that we digitize and put online. Now, the advantage to that, and what we're trying to do with the Joseph Smith papers and this volume I showed you on Mountain Meadows, is to allow the user, allow the reader to get face-to-face with the documents, and as much as possible face-to-face with the historical figures. Everybody who writes interprets. You know, if you go to school and get a PhD, that's what they're going to teach you. As a writer, you are an interpreter. And that's all fine and good. We all need people who take the vast amounts of information, distill it for us, synthesize it for us. But sometimes it's just wonderful to get the interpreter out of the way and just look at the materials directly. And that's what we're trying to do with the Church History Library. Put more of that information online so you can go to it directly and look at it yourself.
Rick, in your research, when they took the Lectures on Faith out of the Doctrine and Covenants, did you
Yes.
ever see any indication that they considered changing the name?
No. Now, by that time, so for those of you who don't understand the issue, when the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants was created, when that volume was created, its name was changed from a Book of Commandments to Doctrine and Covenants. That name had to do with the fact that the first portion of the book contained what today we call the Lectures on Faith. There were 7 lectures on the doctrine of the church. Then starting on page 75 of the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants, you have what we would call revelations today. And so they were covenants and commandments. And so they thought, well, we got these 2 parts of the book. We've got the lectures on the doctrine of the church combined with the covenants and commandments. So let's change the name to the Doctrine and Covenants. By the time the 1921 edition came along and the decision was made to drop out the Lectures on Faith, the name was so deeply entrenched that I don't think there was any serious consideration given to changing the name back to Book of Commandments. Excellent question. Yes?
I'm curious, with all due respect. It seems as I have grown up, Joseph Fielding Smith was whom I admired, but still, he would not share with me everything he knew. Are you called in occasionally for a review of things with Brother Packer? Because I think he is probably of the Joseph Fielding Smith mental position about this. But I'd be surprised to hear different.
There are actually sort of 2 parts to your question, so I'll answer it in 2 parts. One has to do with Elder Packer, and one has to do with sort of how do people look at these things? How did Joseph Fielding Smith look at them? I think that in the era in which Joseph Fielding Smith served as the church historian and recorder, the way of doing history, what we call historiography today, was different from what it is today. It was different not only at the church, it was different in other areas as well. If you look at biography, even film, historical film and other things, it's morphed over time, morphed over a century. In the early days, a lot of what was written about historical figures was what today historians call hagiography. It was deliberately meant to lionize people, and it was often done with texts that were edited in such a way as to promote a position like that. So clearly you've seen a shift since that time, and that shift has been towards one of more accuracy, more precision in what's done. The Joseph Smith papers, I think, represent the highest and best kind of academic approach to church history today. So yes, the approach has changed significantly over time. Now the question of how do church leaders feel about this? The answer is that despite a sense that the church is monolithic, as a matter of fact, the church has a rich diversity of backgrounds and opinions. Church leaders, President Packer among them, has said, there's a rich diversity among the 12. We come from different backgrounds, and I think there's a real blessing to church members in the fact that you have lots of different opinions that come to bear on any subject matter. As far as President Packer and his own feelings towards me and so forth, he was one of several individuals that were responsible for hiring me. So when I don't know if I should probably just rehearse for you quickly how I got the position that I'm in. I was practicing law at a Chicago-based law firm, had a Salt Lake office, and expected I'd do that the rest of my life. And then one day, I got a telephone call from Elder Dallin H. Oaks, recently called as a member of the Quorum of 12 Apostles. And he asked me if I'd like to go out to lunch. Well, I was 29 years old at the time. I knew who he was, but I didn't think he knew who I was. And so I said, sure, it'd be fun to go out to lunch. So I went out to lunch with him, and he asked me lots of questions about church history. What do I read? How do I stay current on church history? How do I know what I know about church history? And so I rehearsed for him. I was, very widely read on books, and I read all the standard periodicals of the day that dealt with church history topics, including ones that might be considered by some controversial. And I mentioned how I stayed on top of all that, and he said thank you. That was the last Monday in 1985. The first Friday of 1986, which was the Friday of that same week, he called me up and said, I enjoyed our lunch. Can you come talk to Elder Packer? So I went and talked to Elder Packer, and I had another interview where he asked me lots of questions. Didn't give me lots of answers, and then his final, and I had no idea why I was being interviewed. My father had been recently called as a mission president. He'd gone through interviews like this, so I knew this kind of thing happened, but I didn't know what the purpose was. I thought maybe they were creating a committee of some sort that dealt with church history. And so President Packer has a sense of humor that manifests itself often in just sort of deadpan. And his final words to me as I walked out the door were, "If you never hear from us again, don't worry about it." So I walked back to my office thinking I will probably never know what this was all about. But I got back to my office and immediately the phone rang again. This time it was Dean Larson, who was the last person before Elder Marlon K. Jensen to have the title of Church Historian and Recorder. And he's the one that called me in and made me the job offer to direct the Church History Department. And for someone with my background who loved church history, books, manuscripts, and so forth, to be offered at age 29 leadership of the entire organization and keys and combinations to everything was a dream come true. So that's how I got where I am. In terms of how people feel about how we do about various things, the consensus is one of greater transparency.
Thank you.
Somebody who hasn't asked a question before? Yes, in the far back.
I understand that John Turner was given a lot of access and was treated very well with the archives.
Yes.
How do you feel about what he produced? How do you like the book?
John and I have been friends for some time. John G. Turner and Matthew J. Groh of our staff and Patrick Mason, who holds the Hunter Chair at Claremont Graduate University, all graduated from Notre Dame University at the same time. They were classmates. And I knew them when they were students. Patrick, in fact, was one of our research assistants on Massacre Mountain Meadows. And I knew them as very good scholars who were sincere, energetic, good writers. And so when John approached me and said, I'm doing a book about Brigham Young, I said, well, let's see what we can do to help you out. So John would often come and say, I need to have access to this, I need to have access to that. And being an advocate of transparency, I said, sure, As far as his book is concerned, if you've read the introduction, the preface, I read the book in manuscript. I gave him my feedback, and I still haven't read it in print. I need to do that. It's on my list. So I don't know what the final product is, but I trust John. I think he's a good scholar, and I think that he's a very sincere, straightforward, honest sort of man. So, and I've heard lots of good things about the book in print. And like I said, I haven't read it in print yet. Right here.
After studying the Doctrine and Covenants and writing this book, did you ever think that maybe there might be some of those revelations that maybe you wished he hadn't have received? And one that comes to mind is the revelation on celestial marriage, which has been nothing but a public relations disaster from 1844 to the present day.
Honestly, I've never thought of any of these revelations as something I wish Joseph Smith had not received. Looking at them, in the 21st century, looking back at them, I find them utterly fascinating. Now, there has no question been a cultural shift over time from Joseph Smith's day to the present, and certainly there are some aspects of what Joseph Smith taught that are considered extremely controversial. That's one of them. That may be the biggest one in terms of controversy. But I've never found myself thinking I wish he hadn't done it. I'm more curious about the circumstances, about the text, and those kinds of things. I find it interesting, too, that a lot of non-Mormon scholars have developed a fascination with Mormon history as well. We're seeing an increasing number of people who are interested in that. We have, of course, the Hunter Chair I mentioned at Claremont. Recently, there's been a Richard L. Bushman Chair established at University of Virginia, Charlottesville, where Rare Book School is located. Another plug for Rare Book School. You're seeing an increasing academic interest in the study of Latter-day Saint history. I think that's all very, very positive. I personally, this is my own bias, but I personally think that it's important to be able to take subjects of any kind and evaluate those subjects from a wide variety of perspectives. When people ask me about that, because sometimes youth are disturbed when they see a perspective that's not their own. And I say, think about it like a piece of sculpture. And if you put a piece of sculpture on a table in the middle and you only looked at it from your perspective, how much about that sculpture would you know? Now do a 360 and see it from all of those angles. And then maybe look at it from the top down and the bottom up. By the time you're done studying it from all those perspectives, you'll know it better and you'll understand it better. That's how I feel about church history. I think there's lots of room for lots of different positions, and I think they're all intriguing to study. So, yes? Chris?
Can I just ask a question regarding the book itself?
Sure.
For those that are interested in delving a little more into the background of the various editions, namely the 1921 and later the 1981, what would you recommend as a good source for finding out information about those editions or the creation of them?
Well, let me back up and talk about the earlier editions first.
Okay.
This volume, these two volumes in the Joseph Smith papers, for your study of the Doctrine and Covenants, this is an absolutely remarkable volume. This 8-pound volume that I jokingly said when we produced it doubles as a home gym. This contains the two earliest record books of Joseph Smith's Revelations. The Book of Commandments and Revelations, which was produced as early as 1831, very, very early, and then the Kirtland Revelation book. So when it came time to publish this text, a lot of our people said, well, let's just do it the same way we did the Journals volume, the smaller format. And I said, you know, we're talking about scripture text here. And I had spent time in my wide wanderings in school with my broad interest. I'd spent time doing ancient texts, including cuneiform texts. And what I found when I did my research into those kinds of things is that if you were doing an ancient Greek manuscript, for example, or a cuneiform text in Sumerian or Akkadian, you would find these large format books that had a photographic image of the object on one side and then a transcription on the right side. So I proposed, as the chairman of the editorial board, I proposed that we do this volume in that format because these are in many cases, the earliest known manuscript texts. And I thought it would be very important for students to see not just our transcription, but the actual manuscripts themselves. Frankly, our people thought that was a crazy idea, in large part because of cost. You know, it costs a lot of money to produce a book like this. So we talked about it for a while, and it gained some traction, a lot of momentum on our staff. And then we had to talk to our print and distribution partner. That's what Deseret Book is. Deseret Book is not our publisher. We are the publisher of the Church Historians Press, but they do our printing and distribution. So we proposed that to them, and their initial reaction was, you're nuts. The book will never sell. It's going to be way too expensive for people to buy. So we brought them over. We brought a delegation of their people over to the Church History Library. We showed them some of the pages that we had typeset and mocked up and said, look at these. Get some sense for the look and feel. And their reaction was to say, hey, this is really, really interesting. To be able to see this text like you're holding the manuscript in your hands and then look at a meticulous transcription, which, by the way, is somewhat inventive as well. For those of you who are familiar with this volume, we take all of the editorial changes and we color code each scribe and show each scribe's changes according to their color. So it's a very, very easy and intuitive kind of transcription system, one you won't see anywhere else. Last year we had the Association for Documentary Editing, which is the highest professional group that focuses on this kind of work in town. These are people from the Benjamin Franklin papers and the George Washington papers and so on. We had them in town, hosted them for their annual conference, and we found a lot of interest among the editors of those documentary editions on the format that we had used for this book. So if you want to talk about the text over time, this is my #1 recommended volume. Now, if you don't want to have the pictures all the time with you, because this is an 8-pound book, we published it in a small format as well without the pictures. That's what this one is. It's the Revelations and Translations Series Volume 1. This doesn't have a volume number on it because it's a facsimile edition, and we're going to do facsimiles of other texts as well in this large format. Volume 2 of the Revelations and Translations series is this one called Published Revelations, which takes you to the earliest published texts of the Doctrine and Covenants. So in here we have a copy of a Book of Commandments and a copy of the text, side-by-side comparison of the text from the Evening and the Morning Star, which is the Independence publication, and Evening and Morning Star, which is the Kirtland reprint of the same. And we show textual development there. Then we go to the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants, and finally the additional chapters that were added for the 1844. And we have the marked up Book of Commandments with Oliver Cowdery's handwritten changes on it for the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants from 1833. So for tracking the text in those early days, these volumes are extremely important. Now moving on from there, certainly Robert Woodford's dissertation on the Doctrine and Covenants helps to get you to the place where Chris is talking about, where he meticulously tracks all of those changes. He completed that dissertation in 1974. It was a volume that was a very significant volume and was formally published in 1981 when the Church's New Triple Combination was published.
I read or heard some time ago, and I don't know where, that Joseph Smith once said that when he received the revelation, he had to determine whether it came from God, from the adversary, or from his own mind. If that quotation is roughly correct from your understanding, would you comment on section 130 in that context, and given the enormous problems that section has caused the church over the years?
So are you talking about 130 or 132?
Maybe I got it wrong.
They're actually connected in some ways, but
the polygamy.
okay, 132.
132.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, there you can find, not verbatim what you just said, but you can find statements of Joseph Smith that are roughly parallel to what you just described, that he had to distinguish between the sources of the revelation, which for believing Latter-day Saints is still a true principle. Still a true principle for believing Latter-day Saints. That you have to decide whether impressions you're getting are coming from, if you're a believer, whether they're coming from the Holy Spirit or whether they're coming from your imagination or some other way. My response to your question, I think, is largely distinguishing between the history and theology. While I am in my own way, my own theologian, I'm a historian by profession. So again, I tend to focus on, I don't spend a lot of time talking about the theological implications of it. In my own mind, because I'm a believing Latter-day Saint, I personally find Doctrine and Covenants section 132 to be part of a volume, the Doctrine and Covenants, which I accept as Scripture. So that's my own personal theological view of it. But that's a faith statement. That's not a historical statement. And in terms of historical statements on the question that you asked, it's impossible to plumb that because you're talking about inside Joseph Smith's mind, and historians can't get in there very easily. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. Could you comment a little bit on how long it took for that revelation to go from Joseph Smith's mind, I think it was around 1832, onto a piece of paper and revealing it to his colleagues?
Yeah, there's good historical evidence to suggest that Joseph Smith was discussing this topic as early as 1831, certainly by 1832. If you look at Jacob chapter 2 in the Book of Mormon, you would say, well, it was on his mind in 1829. In terms of the text itself that we find in D&C 132, that's a July 1843 recording, and it's situational in nature, meaning that if you read it from a historical standpoint, the text in section 132 is not an 1831 text. It's an 1843 text that has to do with the situation in question, which is describing and discussing plural marriage with Emma Smith. I think most of you know the story. Joseph Smith's brother Hiram went to him and said, "Hey, let me. If you write down the revelation, I'll take it to Emma. She's a reasonable woman. I'm sure I can convince her that it's true." And Joseph said he wasn't so sure, and Hiram took it to her and came back and said, "You're right." It's very contextual, that particular part of the text.
Thank you very much for your good questions. Thanks to Rick for an excellent presentation, and he does not evade questions. He gives you a rock solid and candid answer. So let's give him a round of applause. And then we're going to have him sit at the table, and you're all going to come and buy 10 copies of. So please come on up and don't.